Hey, everybody. Ooh, sorry, I haven't spoken in 5 hours. Hey, everybody. Um, could you do me a favor and happy Wednesday? That's right. Uh, and let me know, am I sharing the presentation in the presenter mode? Or what, can you see something? Yes. Okay. And you only see slides, right, Monica? Cool. All right. I don't want to spoil the fun. Alrighty. Um, one thing before I start, I have to. It's not on my iPad, it's on my desktop. Um, does that mean that you're seeing it rotated? With my monitor. Um, oh, it's just smaller on scale. Gotcha. Okay. What if I increase it like that? Okay. Alrighty. All right. I think that'll do the trick then. Um, let me just give me one quick second so that I can see my notes at the same time. Oh, technology. Aditya, did you get the email I sent sometime around 15 minutes ago? Cool, awesome. All right. So I think I'm able to read my own notes now. Okay. All right. Thanks for waiting, folks. So, and also thank you for the flexibility with the changes of schedules. So today, originally you would have had some lecture with Josh. And so because of a little switch, you'll be having two psychology lectures closer to each other. And today we're going to talk about personality. So originally the lecture today was planned to be personality and psychological disorders, but I made the decision, and I hope that you'll agree that it's a good one, that we do some questions today. So I have a few questions at the end of it to kind of practice a little bit of what we've seen. And then in our fourth lecture with me, which is in 2 weeks, we'll do the second part to this lecture as well as the fourth lecture. I thought this would be possible because um, the the content of the fourth lecture is a little shorter, and so is the second half of this one. So hopefully, even then, we'll also have time to do some of the practice questions as well. So hopefully, you'll be okay with that. Um, so just as a reminder, there's off clock except for next week. And then if that time doesn't work for whatever reason, then reach out to me and then we could do some one-on-one stuff. All righty. So did everybody that saw the email do the personality questionnaire? All right, we got one yes. Okay. Well, I hope that more than Sophie were able to uh, do the questionnaire. That would be because it'll hopefully help us out with our discussion. So today we're going to talk about um, personality. And so personality has, no, excuse me. So this is, um, the section for today, which includes personality and psychological disorders. Like with other lectures, I've highlighted the sections that we won't be able to cover together, but that are still really important for you to get to throughout your self-study. The, the part that we're going to focus on today is going to be personality, and personality we'll cover in just a brief definition, and then looking at some of the perspectives that had something to say about personality that you need to know for the test. So without further ado, let's talk about personality. So this is going to be a little bit of a jump from what we've talked about in our previous two lectures, which were very much focused on the little details of sensations and perceptions, attention, and memory. So all of those were kind of granular things and theories that some of them were posited maybe 100 years ago, but somehow have been corroborated by neuroscience. And we've been learning that in the cognitive sense, those things seem to match up to certain theories. Now we're going to look at a subset of psychology that is perhaps the thing that most conventionally people think about psychology in the real world, not so much the stuff that's cognitive. Are people okay? Can they hear me? Okay, alrighty. Tiffany, not sure what's happening, but it seems like I'm coming across okay to most people. All right. So so now we're going to look at bigger categories of psychology. And so as a result, the following slides will have more writing than there's really no way around just learning and accepting some of these details that come with this section. So starting with personality, just to kind of set a framework, we're going to define it as an individual's unique set of consistent behavioral traits. So there's two kind of things that are important here. One is the consistency of it. So the fact that a particular set of behaviors come up in particular situations consistently is what we're going to use as one aspect to define personality. The second part is going to be the distinctiveness of of those personality traits, meaning that many people can find themselves in a similar situation, but might respond differently to it. And that's what also helps us define personality. One way to kind of think of distinctiveness is to think about it in the sense of, say you're in an elevator with a couple other people, and then suddenly the elevator stops. And so what is your reaction might be very different than the reaction of another person. Say maybe you try to crack a joke so that you diffuse the tension. Another person might actually be incredibly anxious, and another person might be just hoping to get out of it because they're bored. So those would be sort of reactions that are distinct. And so keep those two things in mind, the consistency and also the distinctiveness of particular personalities for each person. So when we talk about traits, there's sometimes it's some of these things are actually kind of obvious in the way that we experience them in everyday life, but we aren't very familiar with a lot of these terms. So one way to think about traits, if it ever comes up, is think about them in the form of adjectives, which is like here I gave a list of examples, like honest, dependable, impulsive, and the list goes on. One thing to keep in mind about traits is that there's transits, personality trait. Oh, the second bullet point. Yeah, thank you. So that's a typo. Fundamental traits determine other, thank you for noticing that. Fundamental traits determine other superficial traits. So the idea here is that we're going to look at traits a little bit more deeply. And when we do that, we're going to find that then can go to more superficial ones. So the way to think about them is in terms of surface traits versus source traits. Surface traits are the things that you might see very evidently in the way that you might define a personality trait as what you can see in another person just from your mere observation. Source traits are the ones that are less easy to define and are more abstract, and they're less specific. So one way to kind of think about this as an example, it would be that you might see as somebody as being impulsive or restless, but then as a source trait, something that you might not see is that that could be derived from a basic tendency to be an excitable personality. So those two things are something that you have to keep differentiated, because as we'll see soon, a lot of these theories like to figure out what is the core of these personality traits. I got a question in the chat saying, I got a question in the chat saying, what is the difference between personality and a personality trait? So that's a really good question. So the personality trait is going to be a disposition of behaving in a particular way in a particular situation. So think about a personality trait as the sort of in the moment use of some aspect of personality. Personality as a whole is going to be the sort of disposition in general towards several different aspects of life. So trait, I like to think about the sort of specific, as if you have in your personality a series of traits, and that's what you pull out in a particular moment for a particular situation. And then Sophie's asking an example of source trait being an introvert. Introvert is, we're definitely going to talk about introvertedness very soon, but I wouldn't call it quite a source trait, just because it will, as we'll see with introvertedness, that is one aspect of several different source traits. So source trait is something like that, I think is something even deeper than that. And I think it'll become clearer once we look at introvert versus extrovertedness. Yes, exactly, Marissa. Yeah, that's a good summary of it. Personality is some aspect of that personality. And another example of a source trait, let's see. The one that I had was that a source trait could be being fundamentally excitable, which then would manifest in surface traits as potentially anxious in particular situations, or irritable or impatient. I'll have to get back to you to think of another example of another source trait. Part of why it's difficult to come up with source traits, Sophie, is because their nature is to be abstract and something that is big and encompassing of so many different ideas. So the moment that I think of an example, I can find that it kind of is specific. So that's a good way to kind of think about it, is if you actually struggle to think of examples of source traits, it's because they're things that we don't often think about. We often think about them as surface traits. So I hope that in some way kind of helps out. Right, exactly. So Brooke is posting here an example of source traits. And that's something that we'll see in just a moment, actually, yes, I got a message that we can move on. Yes, we'll move on. But yes, Brooke, that is an example of source traits. So now we're going to look at the core of personality. So when it comes to thinking about what is a surface trait and what is a source trait, there are several theorists out there who focus their energies on trying to figure out, well, what subset of these traits is actually the fundamental stuff. So Brooke just posted something from somebody who theorized there were 16 source traits. And that is just one of several different theories that you'll have to know for the MCAT. One of them that you will have to know is the ones posited by Gordon Allport. And so he looked at personality being made up of universal set of traits. So he compiled over 4,600 traits, and he just did this by looking at a dictionary and grabbing the adjectives in the dictionaries. And he compiled this list of English adjectives that he said were part of a universal set of traits. So his idea was that these universal categories. The first one is the cardinal traits. And so these are the dominant traits that influence our behavior in all aspects of our life. And I'll talk about in a second why they're rare and develop later in life. But just for the moment, think about them as incredibly dominant traits that is something that a person becomes associated to entirely. Central traits are much more common, and they're general characteristics that you can think about in terms of a personality of yourself and people that you know. These are big descriptors still, but they're less dominant than the cardinal traits. And then when it comes to secondary traits, this is the one that's related to very specific situations and times. So they have to do with your particular attitudes and preference at a certain point in time. So without any sort of examples, these can be kind of hard to exactly detail. They can be hard to kind of understand. For secondary traits, you can think about them as, for example, getting anxious when you're talking in front of a crowd. Let's say a person doesn't have a personality trait of being constantly anxious their whole life, but is anxious when speaking to a crowd, or maybe anxious when waiting in a line. So you wouldn't say that that's defining of their personality, but what Alport would call it is that it's a secondary trait that comes up in that situation. The central traits would be something more like being intelligent, shy, anxious, honest. And that is something that you could say like this in the description of a friend. The classic example would be like, how would you describe your friend in 3 words? And so those would be the kinds of traits that would show up, the central traits. The cardinal traits is the one that doesn't show up very often in society. But when it does show up, the person becomes very much associated with that cardinal trait. An example for that is, for example, Christ. We have even a word, it's Christ-like. So we have an entire trait, cardinal trait that's associated with the person. There's more examples, and we read and hear them in our culture all the time, such as Freudian, Machiavellian, and narcissistic, which is associated with Narcissus from the Greek fables. So those are kind of examples of them. Of this, I just ask you that you understand that cardinal traits in a trick question would be perfectly said as like the person's most dominant trait in their life. But it's still something that isn't something that most people recognize them for. So it's important for you to make the distinction. In the Zoom room have cardinal traits is very low. So that's a good way to think about it. I got an exam. I got a question saying example of a cardinal, like unconscious biases. If you could elaborate on that direct question, that would be great about unconscious biases. I got another question saying that not everybody has cardinal traits. That's correct. So not everybody has cardinal traits. Gordon Allport proposed that in some of the instances for a few subset of society, cardinal traits were developed, and they're so big that their life is defined by those traits. One of the mnemonics that I propose right here for you is Outport the Cardinal Can Sing. So I'll be throwing some mnemonics in this lecture because you'll find that you're going to need a couple of them to get through the material. Mm. So another question of why Freud would be a cardinal trait. Freud would be what we would call Freudian as the adjective is a particular trait that has to do with the fact of focusing on unconscious desires. So without thinking too much about having to know about his theories, about his particular development in psychoanalysis, you just think about it in terms of the act of the meaning behind the adjective of Freudian. And Marissa, that's a really interesting question. Like Teresa or Nelson Mandela for cardinal traits. In my opinion, those aren't particular cardinal traits. Those are just really culturally relevant people in our society, which is not to say that they're cardinal traits in and of themselves. So the traits are things that which the person embodies. So instead of thinking about Nelson Mandela and Mother Teresa, think about in those instances of, for example, Christ-like. In most people for Westernized cultures, you probably have some sort of understanding of the meaning of the trait Christ-like. Examples you gave the main ones you're going to hear about. Exactly. Thank you, Leandro. All righty. So the next one that that you need to know for personality is looking at the Myers-Briggs. So Myers-Briggs is, you can just think about it in terms of the test. You don't have to think about who Myers or Briggs was in the formation of their personality test. But the relevant part here is that they combination of different personality traits. So they thought that there would be 16 personality types. And the way that they stratified them was by looking at the polars between 4 different big categories. So those are going to be the extroversion, introversion, sensing versus intuition, thinking versus feeling, and judgment versus perception. So I need everybody to post in the chat, what is your Myers-Briggs type? Thank you, Tiffany. If you could post the letters. All righty. Okay. We have an even balance of, actually, no, we have well, several more I's, a lot of N's, a fair balance of F and T, and and J's. So the last part of it, which was the turbulent and something, the last A part, that's specific to the particular website and must be some sort of new take on the Myers-Briggs test that they added that for, and I didn't read too much into what the enhancement was, but the Myers-Briggs original test includes 4 letters. And so the letters, what they say is whether you fall within in these spectrums within whether you fall closer to the source traits of, say, introversion versus extroversion. So what you need to know for the test is that you have 16 personality types. Incidentally, why do you know you have 16? Or rather, let me put it this way. Instead of asking you, I'm going to tell you because I'm not that actually. It's Oh, sorry, my dog has a toy. Um, you have the same as Beyonce. That's so funny. It's not Brooke and Moral. It's not 4 times 4. It's 4 raised to the 2nd. So it's something to keep in mind when it comes to looking at probability and the amount of things. That's also the same reason why you have the amount of Cotto. 3 raised to the power of uh, of 4. I believe that's how the math works. So keep that in mind because it'll show up in the other tests too. And so it's a quick way to remember that. So what you need to know about this for your MCAT, unfortunately, you won't have any help by knowing your Myers-Briggs type, but that does help kind of clarify the sense that, okay, what they're trying to get at is the core of personality. And in this case, it's subdivided into these 16 subtypes. Can you have multiple of 16 types? Wait, so I got a question in the chat saying, so let me clarify what I mean by 16 types. There are 16 possibilities of combinations between these options. So everybody will be one of those 16 possible combinations. That's what I mean. So I hope that clarifies it. You can't be more than one of the 16. Okay. And I got another question. 4 raised to the 2nd power is 4 times 4. Correct. Yeah, that's right. If that's what you were originally thinking, that it's 4 raised to the 2nd power, then you're correct. All right. So the next one that we'll look at in terms of using more of the trait perspective is a group of people who used a concept in statistics known as factor analysis. So for the following people that we're going to talk about, they didn't perceive that you could simply combine it into by looking at a dictionary and saying that you understood all of the different personality traits and then reduce them into categories. Instead, they employed statistical techniques with statistics that's beyond the scope of the MCAT, a technique of factor analysis, which tries to grab different categories and then find structures between many variables. That's all you need to know about what the factor analysis is trying to achieve. So when it comes to this one, there's one prominent researcher by the name of Cattell, which I think Brooke already brought up. And that is looking at the 16 personality factor. So in the case of Raymond Cattell, he used he thought that you could completely just, and the way that he came upon these traits was through factor analysis. The next person that you need to know who also used factor analysis is going to be, I can't pronounce this word. So if somebody figures it out, please let us know what the correct pronunciation is for this. But Eysenck, that's what I'm going to call it right now, found that through factor analysis that you could actually look at it through 3 major dimensions of personality. And these 3 ones he defined as extroversion, neuroticism, and psychoticism. Like the Myers-Briggs, the way that it's classified is by looking at a spectrum. So as you can see in the diagram, extroversion is one spectrum, neuroticism is another, and psychoticism is the last one. Then you can go from high to low. So whereas the Myers-Briggs showed introversion versus extroversion, here we're not going to look at defining what the poles are, except that they're high and low on those categories. it's pretty much all you need to know about it. Unfortunately, you do need to know the name of it. And you need to know these three particular categories. And one way that I like to remember it is by calling it Isaac's pen, which is psychoticism, extroversion, and neuroticism. Okay, all right. So now, oh, and there's a third one, excuse me. And here's the 5-factor model. This is also known as the Big Five, and they have a personality test that you do need to commit to memory for the test. So this is, oh, excuse me. So this is another one of those tests that is quite prominent today, but instead of looking at 4 categories like the Myers-Briggs, it's looking at 5 traits. And so what it does is that it measures the people taking the test at what particular level they are on these 5 big traits, as they call it, which you could think of source traits. So they categorized it as neuroticism, extroversion, openness, agreeable, and conscientiousness. I think this is one of the most common, oh, excuse me. I think this is one of the most common acronyms you can find for the MCAT, which is OCEAN. So one of the things that's interesting that the MCAT might not test you on, but definitely will raise the concept of Big Five with, is talking about socioeconomic models. And with socioeconomic models, it turns out that for those scoring in certain categories in the top 20% is a function of their socioeconomic model. Correlations of one of the ways that it's seen is that correlations with high GPAs are associated with scoring in the top 20th percentile of conscientiousness. And that if you score high on neuroticism, it elevates your probability of divorce. So nothing that you have to commit to memory in terms of the socioeconomic status, but it's something to think about in the context of how a lot of these theories were developed by people measuring what success in westernized cultures is measured by and how it looks. And so it comes without a surprise that people who are either becoming assimilated to westernized culture or entirely outside of it might not do very well on these different variables. So does that make sense? Yes, good. All right. Give me one quick second. Thank you. My dog was eating a plant. Okay. So, oh, I went too fast. Okay. All right. Eating a pie. No, it's eating a plant. Okay. Perfect. So that's the gist when it comes to looking at personality as looked as a combination of specific traits. But now we're going to move on to probably the most influential of the personality theories that Psychology 101 will introduce you to pretty much right away, which is the psychodynamic thought. Oh, and I got a question. SES stands for socioeconomic status. And that's a pretty common acronym that you'll probably see a lot in sociology. So hopefully with repetition, it'll become pretty something you're used to. So the psychoanalytic theory is something that was proposed by Sigmund Freud. He did a lot of different studies that have a lot of big influence in focus on personality. He initially arrived to psychology when the field was still very much in its very early stages. He arrived through it through medicine, specifically as a neurologist. And he was working at a time in the turn of the century between the 18 and 1900s in Western Europe. So there's a lot of the sort of social movements happening in his time that very much are evident influences in how he thought about the workings of human psychology. Specifically, we're going to focus on how he was influential for our ideas of personality. He believed that childhood experiences were probably the most fundamental thing that contributed to what people's personalities were. He also thought that unconscious desires and drives were the ones that innately um, sort of modeled um, our personality. And especially these drives and desires, the way that we dealt with them, were going to be later on reflected in our adult lives. And he proposed something that probably is the most lasting of his contributions that still holds up, which are coping mechanisms. And we're going to talk about those. So, just to define a couple of things, he thought about drives as being instinctual. Drives meaning the sort of the sort of needs that we have as what he considered sort of primordial human needs, and that motivated behavior. And so, when it came to those drives, there's two really big ones you need to know. One is libido, and the other one is death instinct. They're kind of confusing because, especially libido, I think it's something that comes up more in regular vernacular. But when it comes to Freud's definition of it, it's actually what he thought about as a sort of energy source. So while conventionally one might think about it more in terms of sexual terms, the what he thought about it was the sort of the primitive source that then motivated us to then, find food, find a mate, find safety. And so these are kind of motivated by these survival, growth, and pleasures. Death instinct is kind of an interesting one, and one that definitely seems the most bizarre to me, which is it's an instinct that promotes aggressive behavior. And yeah, that's right, Leandro. There's a lot to that in this. We'll learn by looking at Freud stuff that he definitely contributed to our understanding of like growth and optimism. So there's a death instinct that is about aggressive behaviors and a motivation to die or to hurt oneself or others. So I know it sounds very bizarre when you think about it. But one way to kind of consider where this comes from is the context that he was in Europe in a particular time that was just through the First World War. So it was a time when socially nobody had ever really experienced sort of mass casualty and violence at the level as World War I had up until that point. And so in his theorizing about what drives human nature, he definitely thought that aggression was one of those one of those primitive things. And so think about the death instinct as just what drives aggression, as if it's actually a part of our personalities to become aggressive. And I'll show you in what ways in just a moment we counteract that, because hopefully we don't lead our lives aggressive all the time. And I got a question. The theory he proposed was primitive animal-like. The theory he proposed was that there were instincts that were primitive and animal-like. And he also proposes the different ways in which we cope with these and kind of perform behaviors in regular day society that aren't aggressive and aren't primitive, if everything goes well. Right. So if that's a good way to think about it. There's definitely a clear association between the libido and sex. It's just important to think that libido is something that is present throughout the entire life of a human, according to Freud. And so when you're thinking about babies, you don't think about them conventionally as having libido because they're babies, but that's where this extra definition of energy source comes through because babies have the motivation to breastfeed, or to suckle at things and those kinds of things in Freud's opinion. Okay. So he went on, so we've talked about in trait theory how they categorized it from a lot of different traits into a few generalized buckets. In this case, Freud looked at personality not as traits, but as composed of three subcomponents. He called these the id, the ego, and the superego. The id he defined as the part of our personality that is primitive, the decision making in our everyday and aware life. And that is driven by the reality principle. The superego is what he called the one responsible for figuring out the moral imperatives of our life, and definitely the one that was the arbiter of what is right and what is wrong. So these components are organized in two parts of the mind, the conscious and the unconscious mind. There is no better way to remember this than by looking at the diagram. And the diagram shows you the iceberg, which is one of the most common ways to talk about the structure of personality according to how Freud saw it. The iceberg is, and the iceberg is definitely a good way to think about it because it shows you the perspective of how much is above the surface and how much is below the surface. And there's one aspect here of this slide that is called the preconscious. I ask you not to think about the preconscious because it's going a level too deep of detail that you don't need to know for the MCAT. So spare yourself that needing to know that. And I'm not sure if I know why it gets a bad rap, Phyllis, but I'll tell you why it does have a hard time in Freud's theories, which is that the way that these three elements have interplay is that they interact with each other with the ego being the mediator. So the ego is the one that has a hard time balancing the urges of both the superego and the id. So one way to think about this is that you have a person with an angel on one shoulder and a devil on the other shoulder. And so the ego is the person making the choices that are mediated between these two different poles. The pole of the id would be the one to seek pleasure. And one way to one example to think about it would be, according to Freud, that you are working in your office and there's a particular coworker who has a habit of tapping a pencil while they're thinking, and it really irritates you because it's so distracting. So what Freud proposes is that the id would go so far as to harm the person who's doing that, your coworker. He could, for all he knows, he would say he would go as far as to kill the person. The superego is really acceptable as a response to something that's irritating. And so it's saying you have to not kill the person. It's not saying like whether it's irritating or not, it's just saying what is right and what's wrong. So the ego is the one that then manifests via decision making your response to something. So I hope that example makes sense. The last thing I want to say about this slide is that the conscious and unconscious mind are different levels of which you are mentally processing things. In Freud's conception of this, the conscious mind is awareness. So everything we talked about in the last two lectures is what Freud would consider conscious mind, because we're talking about the things that we're sensing and we're perceiving and we're thinking. The things that we haven't talked about is the unconscious mind. And these are things that are buried so deep that it's very difficult to access these particular thoughts. In his mind, these would be very much repressed memories, repressed to the point that you couldn't bring them to conscious awareness. But it turns out that even though you can't think about them in conscious awareness, they're still there, according to Freud. And the thoughts between the superego and the id are often coming into conflict. And when they come into conflict, the conflict can manifest itself in a number of ways through the ego. And one way that you need to know is the Freudian slip. And that's the one that I think all of us have experienced at some point in our lives, which is that we intend to say something, but something else comes out that is also relevant to our thought process. The example that I put here, I really like, which is that a financially stressed patient exclaims, "Don't give me any more bills. I mean, pills." So this is something that definitely that you've probably experienced in your life. Leandro, I can, excuse me, sorry. Yes, I can elaborate on primary and secondary process thinking, but perhaps give me a second once we get through some of these theories. Uh, the but for the purposes of the psychoanalytic theory, you don't have to think about quite how to relate those processes, and we'll talk about that in a moment. The last thing I want to say about this slide and move on is that notice that the superego and the ego live in both the conscious and the unconscious. Okay, whereas not, it's that analogy I said about a devil and angel on your shoulder. The reality is that it's flawed because you actually never realize the devil is there, but you can realize the angel is there. So I hope that makes that a little bit more accurate and easy for you to see in your mind. Freudian slip exemplifying conflict. Yeah, yeah, that's a really good way to put it. Perfectly stated right there. Freudian slip is not the only way that conflicts manifest itself, but it's the one that is really good for you to know for the test. All right. So here's the thing that we actually still take away from Freud's theory, and something that you have to know for the test, which is the ways in which anxiety is dealt with for us in our day-to-days. So for Freud, anxiety was the result of conflict between the id and the superego that, as we talked about, is mediated by the ego. Specifically, he thought that anxiety was the expression of long-standing conflict. So it's not something that just occurred, and so you have an expression of it, but rather something that you've been processing for a while. And the way to relieve the unpleasantness of an experience of anxiety is through what he termed defense mechanisms. The defense mechanisms are varied, and they could be specific in what they're the defense mechanism, or they could be very broad categories. The ones you need to know for the test and the sort of ways that they're defined is in this table right here. And there are some things that we might be able to think in terms of like everyday terms, but some of them are unfortunately just new to us and we have to commit them to memory. So I'll go through them fairly quick, and then you can let me know if any one of those poses a question for you. But repression is the one that's easiest to think of, which is you just bury the things you don't want to think about. And so that relieves anxiety, because if you bury it, then you don't experience it. Projection is the one where we attribute our negative feelings that we have about something to other people, other targets that are somehow still related to that feeling. So the example that I like is that a person dislikes their boss, but they think that their boss dislikes them. So that somehow relieves the anxiety about that is created by this anxiety. It relieves the discomfort about the anxiety of disliking somebody by giving them, um, projecting onto them. Uh, Unfortunately, all of our pets and our loved ones experience from us at all times. And displacement is the one where you have a negative emotion that you, then project onto a target, usually a target that is much safer to do so. So instead of being angry at your boss and manifesting that to your boss, you come home and then you tell your dog to stop eating the plant a little bit more forcefully than you needed to. And so that's a classic example of displacement. Reaction formation is one that I remembered by, yeah, thanks for asking, Michaela, because I often wonder this myself. Um, but projection, you can think about it in terms of a mirroring. That's how I like to keep a distinction between the two. So let's say I feel jealous of a particular friend. And so then projection would be, the defense mechanism would be to project that and then thinking that the friend is actually jealous of me. So it's the same sort of, anxiety driven idea, but reflected onto the other target. When you think about displacement, that's actually to do with somebody else entirely. And you're trying to relieve that tension onto a different target. So I hope that helps you, distinguish the two. That's sometimes, displacement is called a type of projection, but it's big enough in a distinction between the targets that it's actually considered separate for the purposes of the MCAT. I hope that clarifies that. Reaction formation, yeah, that's not a, it wasn't the greatest example. So I think if you can stick to the example, provided here about, the woman and her boss, I think that's a better example of it. Um, and something a little bit more relatable. So instead of thinking like, I just like my boss, that might bring up more anxiety than projecting that onto the boss and saying like, oh, actually what's going on is that my boss dislikes me. So it takes the onus of disliking away from you and puts it onto somebody else. Reaction formation is the one that, I used to think about in terms of, I still think about in terms of the Hey Arnold one, but I realized that I might be dating myself and people didn't watch that cartoon. You guys didn't see that cartoon, did you? Hey Arnold. Yes. Okay. Okay, good. We have some older people in the room. Thank goodness. I was totally shook when I was talking about, flashbulb memories and thinking about how quite possibly 9/11 is not a flashbulb memory for some of you. So now I'm beginning to question all of my examples. But but anyways, so for those of you who have seen Hey Arnold, it's the Helga thing that she does. Reaction formation is where she, is constantly bullying Arnold, but she in fact loves Arnold. She adores him to the point that she has a shrine in her closet made out of like gum and disgusting debris of Arnold's football shaped head. And and so she absolutely loves him. And so that's what reaction formation is. Oh gosh, Monica, that's like the best part. She had it in the closet with the shrine and candles. And anyways, think about this in terms of like the classic, like, sort of first crush, sort of example, which is that, a little kid is, so in love with somebody, but their response to that is, to actually bully them, and act in the opposite way of their true feelings. So think about reaction formation being the opposite, of the feeling, which is that's coming out. One way to think about reaction formation that's not, Hey Arnold, is of, somebody, the opposite being that somebody hates somebody else very intensely. And so the way that they manifest that is by praising them and apparently loving them. Regression is one that you'll probably see in the terms of psychological disorders. And that one is when you are reversing to immature patterns of behavior. And this one is kind of bizarre, but it's something that has been shown to come up in different forms of studying people's personalities, which is that sometimes particular events that are stressful might make somebody act a little more childlike. In milder forms, it might look like a tantrum, where there's elements of it that are irrational. And even bigger ways that Freud saw was that people would go back to periods of their life without speech and with needing a mother's affection and suckling at their thumbs. So that's regression for it. Rationalization is one that I like to think about it more in terms of the example, which is a student watches TV instead of studying and saying, additional study won't do me any good anyways. It's a way, or in this case, trying to avoid. So turning, the avoidance of that negative feeling into a plausible excuse, something that's rational. So that's a little bit of rationalization. Identification is probably one that is the least important of this list. But that's, upping your sense of self-esteem and then forming like imaginary connections to other important people or important groups. So the example here is that a young man joins a fraternity to boost his self-esteem. That's pretty much all you need to know about identification, is that you try to identify with the group that helps counteract the negative emotion that you're experiencing. Sublimation is the last one, and that one you definitely need to know, which is channeling the negative emotion into socially acceptable manifestations. So the one that I like to think about is that a person who has a lot of aggression towards, let's say, their parrot for whatever reason, takes up boxing to take out their aggression in socially acceptable terms, because it is acceptable to punch a punching bag very hard than it is to punch your parrot. And so that's the way that I like to think about sublimation, is that you find the one that is a socially acceptable way of manifesting that. Unfortunately, like I said, you do have to think about these for the MCAT, identification being the one that I put on the iffy list of needing to know, but the rest definitely. And like all the other things we've talked about so far, more than the definition, I think that the better way to do that is by having their examples ready in your mind, because more often than not, you're going to get an example and then it's going to ask you, which of these does it sound like? So that's why I think it's a little bit better to think about them in examples that work for you. So the last thing we'll say about Freud is that he proposed some psychosexual stages. And this is another vestige of old things that probably don't hold up in modern psychology, but that the MCAT for some reason still expects us to know. But the way that he thought about this was that, as I said earlier, childhood experiences were so, in his mind, so formative to then who we were as adults. In fact, he thought that that was pretty much the critical period that would define us. I can already imagine you have some sort of criticism of that theory. But the way that he thought about it was that these stages were centered on different things, on different sort of a different focus that we had to progress through before going on to the next one. And then at the end of these stages, if everything went well, then we would be fully well adjusted, like, and functioning in society. Obviously, Freud's kind of take on most things were kind of how things didn't end up going according to plan and where people got stuck. And he called those things fixations, which was that that a person had at a particular stage an issue with that stage and did not progress as full and as expected. And so then had a fixation later on in their adult life that was reflective of that particular stage where they had the fixation. So the way that he thought about it was in terms of 5 stages. They're organized here in the chart for you from oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital. And there's ages that are associated that he observed, and those are the ones that are right there. I'm sorry to say that you do need to know the ages associated to them. It's unfortunate, but the way that I kind of thought about them was that it's not even that good, but I kind of thought about them as uh, between oral and anal, it's 1 year of separation. Between anal and phallic, it's 2 years of separation. And between phallic and latent, some might say 3 years of separation. In this case, it's saying 2. So I thought about it as 1, 2, 3. But in this case, this diagram doesn't clearly show the 3. And then genital is like puberty onwards. Though the way that that the MCAT will test you on this is not by saying what is the age range, and then with really close figures, so you have to know exactly. The way that they're going to test you on this is by saying that a pre-adolescent, thank you, Michaela, exactly. This is another one that you need acronyms for. The way that the MCAS will test you on it is by saying that a prepubescent, let's say a prepubescent boy is experiencing blah, 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 blah. And then they will say, the question will say, what is one of the things that, so think about it in that question, what it's asking you is that it hasn't yet developed the things that are above puberty. So then your answer would have to do with the genital stage. Likewise, if they give you, say, a boy age 8, they're going to say, what are the things that they have not developed? Well, age 8 is in the middle, so you can kind of think of latency. They're in the middle of latency, so they are developing those things, but they haven't yet touched the things that are in the genital stage. So think about the questions in those terms. So you won't be ever asked for details, but you will be asked about them framed around the different cutoffs for the different ages. The thing you don't need to know too much for the MCAT is the erotic focus of it. I think that's too much detail, which is given to you in the 3rd column there. But perhaps the 4th column is something that you should definitely commit to memory, which is the sort of actions that if the stage is completed successfully, those actions are then checked off with as like being completed fully. And so they're pretty, I kind of think that they make sense between the oral being the key task of that stage is weaning, so that you go from only consuming breast milk to then other foods. The anal is the toilet training. These are kind of bizarre, I know. The phallic is identifying with adult role models. And don't worry about the Oedipal crisis or Oedipus complex. I think that's a little bit too in-depth for the MCAT. Latency is expanding social contacts. So this is kind of a period where I'd like to think about it, nothing in the sexual sense is taking place, nothing in terms of any organs or any sexual development. Instead, it's like a social development. And then puberty and onwards, you move into intimate relationships. So it kind of makes sense when you think about like what happens when people start going to junior high and high school, you know, people start dating. So unfortunately, you do need to know those, and let me know if you have any questions about them. So the last person I want to talk about in terms of the psychodynamic perspectives is Jung. Um, Jung is somebody who was very close to Sigmund Freud. He was a little bit younger. He, in fact, was so devoted to his work that when they met, they purportedly talked for 13 hours straight. And a lot. And they agreed on a number of different levels up until a certain point when they disagreed so much that they could no longer be friends. Jung is still somebody that we put into the psychodynamic bucket of psychology, but his we don't call psychoanalytic, we call analytic psychology. Not something you need to know very much, but just know that there's a distinction. When you see psychoanalytic, you have to think Freud and only Freud. However, when you see psychodynamic, you have to think Freud and Jung. I know it's weird, but you got to know those two distinctions. Jung, in terms of the MCAT, is really quite easy. You don't have to know very much, except that Jung agreed with, yeah, I'll love, yeah, let me reiterate that. Psychoanalytic equals Freud. Psychodynamic, dynamic equals Freud and Jung. Okay, hope that makes sense. So Jung is psychodynamic, like Freud is, and lots of things are shared in common. But he thought about the unconsciousness being subdivided even further. So his preoccupation wasn't the super ego, id, and ego that was Freud. His preoccupation for the purposes of the MCAT was looking at the unconscious. So if you remember the diagram previously of the iceberg, that was like the sea level part of it. But he subdivides it further into the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious. So he thought that the personal unconscious was more of the stuff that Freud thought was the unconscious. So it's kind of, you can kind of put parallels between those two, meaning that the unconscious was a lot of stored and repressed information. The collective unconscious, however, was the innovation that he proposed, which was that it's a place where latent memory traces are stored. And these are memories that Jung proposes we inherit from our ancestors. These are not memories from our own personal experiences. It's something that by just the faculty of being human, we have inherited these memories. This is something we haven't talked about in the memory lecture. We did not talk about some like an inherited memory. But Jung proposed this, and the reason why he proposed it, right? The reason he proposed it was because he began to see these memories that showed up, or what he called memories, that showed up in different cultures. And he defined that as archetypes. Was the mandala. The mandala, which is seen here, he thought was a symbol for the unified whole of the self, the wholeness of the self. And he saw it represented throughout different cultures. The first one on the top is Native American, Zuni specifically. The second one is German, and the third is Tibet. He was so surprised that these cultures never spoke to each other, never had any sort of means of communicating their cultural beliefs with one another, and yet that these symbols showed up in society. And so that's what led him to think about this collective unconsciousness. For the purposes of the MCAT, take away the fact that he came up with the innovation of collective unconscious that was composed of archetypes. And archetypes, you had to do no particular work to have them within yourself. So they are not a part of your personal experience. You don't need to know any specific archetypes beyond that. But if you're familiar with literature or studying in terms of like even like in English classes, you would speak about things in terms of like the archetype of the hero or the maiden in distress or the villain. So this is related to the same idea of archetypes, which is that according to Freud, according to Jung, we have these definitions that have been there culturally and are within us, even without us ever having to explicitly learn it. All right. So we're going to move on from the psychodynamic perspective. Oh, no, excuse me. One really quick thing about psychodynamic perspective. I don't think you need to know anything on this slide for the MCAT specifically, but it's just good for general knowledge that that there are pros to the psychodynamic approach. One of them is very clearly that they were the ones that helped us understand that there are unconscious forces that influence our behavior, meaning the stuff that is not observable and things that are not easy to measure. Um, the the notion of internal conflict manifesting in stress is something that it has been proven to be real. Uh, the fact that childhood experiences affect our personality in adulthood is also something that has been proven to be real, as well as defense mechanisms over and over seem to be one of the pivotal ways that we alleviate stress and negative emotions. The cons to that go on and on, perhaps more than the pros. And they include things like the fact that it can't be tested. Freud, the way that Freud talk therapy by talking to people, but there wasn't much analysis beyond their own observations of it. And even then, they were looking at unrepresentative samples. In the case of Freud, he was looking at samples of mostly distressed women for a lot of the things that helped to inform his theories about psychosexual development. And it comes as no surprise that there's sexism to his thoughts that were very biased against women and women's experiences, especially at a time when women were even more than now in repressive positions. And there's inadequate evidence for it, quite simply. And so even though some of the things are grand theories that sort of sound nice once you start reading about them, there's just not a lot of evidence that they hold true. I got a question about archetypes not being your specific experience. And yeah, I'll clarify that, meaning that archetypes are not something that you learn. That's what I mean by specific experience. There's not, according to Jung, there isn't a point in your life where some experience, like for example, learning in a classroom about archetypes, is actually the point where you began having archetypes in your collective unconscious. Instead, he says that archetypes are there from the moment that we are born in a place called the collective unconscious. He didn't go so far as to say where in the brain or anything like that, because remember, this wasn't a time when they were very concerned about where these things were and how they work cognitively. But it was something that he arrived from looking at his different patients. So I hope that answers the question. So now let's move on to the behavioral perspectives. So this one, there's a couple of different people that you need to know about, and they are people that you will come across in your studies of the topic of learning in psychology. So it's something we haven't spoke about, but the people who contributed a lot to our understanding of learning have inadvertently contributed to our idea of personality. For the most part, behavioral theorists weren't super concerned about personality, but they were concerned about the things that in our mind ends up making personality. I'll explain a little bit more what I mean by that. So they weren't interested in the processes that are inside people. So they rejected the things that came from the psychodynamic perspective. The reason is because they were just unobservable, and they were determined to only look at things that were observable, external So that's a word that you definitely need to keep straight for the psych section. Determinism is one that says that not only in the sense of behavioral perspectives on personality, but in general, determinism is the one that says that the environment is the influence on our responses. So that means that it's not, think about it in the sense of nature versus nurture. Deterministic approaches say that it's all nature. And, no, excuse me, pardon, I said the wrong thing. They would say that everything is nurture, meaning that the environment, nothing to do with nature. They were so they were not concerned at all with like how we are born and the kinds of things that we carry within us because of this simple premise that you cannot measure that. The main person that you can think about for behaviorism is B.F. Skinner. And Skinner is the one that was very concerned with learning. Correct. I got a question in the chat. Environmental doesn't mean nature necessarily. In this instance that I said environmental, I'm equating it to nurture, meaning the environment that is responsible for teaching an individual something. Environment in this case, I don't mean nature. Nature, what the nature versus nurture dichotomy is that nature is the genetics, the things that you already have with you biologically. So good to keep that in mind. When it comes to Skinner, he came to his ideas of learning a lot from looking at pigeons and rats, of all things. But it turns out that a lot of these things translated to a conception of personality according to behaviorists. So they looked at personality being the result of just a collection of responses to particular situations. So instead of thinking about like, oh, that person's funny, you know, and instead of thinking about, oh, like perhaps they come from a long line of comedians or something like that, the behaviorist would say that person is funny because that person has had the experience of telling a joke before and receiving praise for that. And so then that reinforces that person to say jokes more often. And then they become what is conceived of as funny and have an impression of themselves as funny. But it's entirely to do with the fact that they have had experiences that reward for you to keep in mind. So there's a diagram right over here that says telling jokes. And then there's a reinforcer, which is laughter or attention or praise and all those kinds of things. They don't think, like the psychodynamic theorists thought, that there was a particular point in life where personality was developed. Instead, they thought it was continuous. And it makes sense, right? Because as long as you're still learning from your experiences in the real world, then your personality is also subject to change in the same ways. And there's no particular stages, which is great for us because we don't have to remember any more stages for them. The things that we do have to remember for them, though, are in particular with this other theorist called, oh no, excuse me. No, that's it. That's all I have for behavioral perspectives, which is good. And that's truly all you need to know about behavioral perspectives. I got myself confused when I saw Bandura because Bandura is somebody who was originally a behaviorist, and in many ways in psychology is still called lumped within the behaviorist one, meaning the group of people who are deterministic because they have to measure specifics in order to say that something is actually true. But Bandura actually stretched out of the boundaries of behaviorism and came to propose something outside of it, but still using some of the fundamentals of behaviorism. The thing that he was against in terms of behaviorism was that he thought that human experience was obviously not mechanical. In the sense, I mean mechanical in the sense that he thought that we obviously didn't have, we did an act at random and then had a response to that. And then according to whether it was positive or negative, we did it or we never did it again. He thought like, that's obviously not like, if you just think about it, like there's so much about us that has drives and motivations and things that sometimes are beyond whether we've experienced them or not personally. He was then proved right with oh, I'll talk about that in the next slide, with an experiment that he did with a Bobo doll, which proved his point that not everything that defines a personality comes from personal experience that's rewarded or punishment or punished, but instead it can actually be from learning from the experiences of others. In terms of personality for Bandura, he also, like the behaviorists, he thought that it was shaped through learning, but he thought that there would reciprocal determinism. So remember, the behaviorists were thinking about determinism. He was thinking about reciprocal determinism, which means that not only does the environment affect it, but the behavior affects the environment. Um, so in the diagram, it shows that in the orange and the blue box, that they have arrows that are reciprocal. And so that was an important distinction for Bandura. He also thought there were personal factors that that were determined by behavior and the environment, but that also influenced those at the same time. So now we're looking at somebody who thought that people were not like, little random players in an environment that just responded to the environment, but he also didn't think that we were masters of our environment either. So think about him as being like a foot inside behavioral theory, but also outside of behavioral theory. I'm trying to think if I have an example of this. Yeah, so one way you can think about the ways that this theory kind of plays out is that a person can select particular situations in their life. So to go back to the example of being considered funny and having a funny personality, it could also be the fact that the person is selecting to tell jokes around specific groups of people that might respond positively to it. So in that is a process that the person is driving the sort of environment that they want to find themselves in. They don't have entire control over how it's going to come, but they do have some influence in it. So I think that's a good example to keep in mind and how it kind of elaborates on the previous model that we saw. The other thing you need to know about Bandura is going to be this concept of observational learning and self-efficacy. Observational learning has a key experiment that you need to know about that you can just think about as the Bobo doll experiment. And it demonstrated that people learn how to respond to certain situations simply by observing others do that behavior. The way that many of you are probably very familiar with the test, but just as a refresher, they grabbed a group of kids, and in one form of the test, they had an experimenter in the same room as when the kids were playing. And the experimenter goes up to a Bobo doll and begins to hit it and kick it and act very violently at the Bobo doll, and also verbalizes things to it, like yelling and saying specific things. And specifically, I think he was saying things like hit it, kick it, as he was doing those things to the doll. The experimenter walks out of the room, and then these kids are left in the room, and then they are given a really complicated puzzle to complete. I can't remember the name for it in psychology, and you don't have to know it either, but it's something that is supposed, it's designed to be an impossible task for the people it's given to. And so these kids are given this really difficult puzzle, and then they're told to stop and they resume their playing or whatever. And in some cases, these kids go up to the bubble doll and hit it and kick it and say exactly the same things the experimenter did. So this is a big experiment that you need to know about, and it will be shown to you in a couple of examples that have to do with, for example, one common passage I've come across is what's the theory behind people advocating to ban violent video games? And the idea behind it is very much related to this observational learning thing, which is that people can learn things by the mere fact of observing them. And so in the case of video games, that people can learn aggression and violence by just viewing it and not acting it out. Something to know about that a good detail to remember is that the classical and operant conditioning is happening vicariously. So remember that I'm telling you that it's kind of related to behaviorism. Behaviorism is related to Skinner and a little bit of Pavlov, who are people who came up with the classical and operant conditioning. So Bandura is saying that it is happening, but it happens vicariously. It doesn't have to happen to you. And that's a point that he calls learning performance distinction, which means that it just simply means that you don't have to perform something to learn it. And so this is another way that it'll show up in psych-soc, is by kids growing up in household environments where parents are in feuds all the time. And so that doesn't mean that the kid is not learning about the experience of how adults in a relationship relate to each other. That the kid is learning about that without performing that particular thing. So I think that makes sense, right? The next and only thing you need to know about this is that the concept of self-efficacy is one in which that Bandura thought that one's belief about their ability to perform something actually affected their expected outcomes. Excuse me, I'm going blind here. Okay. All right. And so the only thing you need to know about self-efficacy is it could be high or it could be low. When it's high, a person feels confident they can do whatever it is they're trying to accomplish. And when it's low, they think that they just don't have any of the capabilities to be able to perform it at the level required, so that it's something that's considered to be innate. So think of those two things, self-efficacy, as being either high or low, not that a person has it or doesn't have it. Think about it as like a person has a low self-efficacy, meaning that they just don't think they can do it. Low self-efficacy would be something like thinking you don't just have it in you for learning organic chemistry. And it's defined in the terms of just not having the necessary abilities for it. Thank you for bringing up self-esteem, because it's important for you to not confuse with self-esteem, which is a different concept. Think about efficacy as having the abilities for it, whereas self-esteem has to do with the sort of positive regard of yourself, regardless to do with anything of abilities or something. And it's something that Bandura thought could be learned through observational learning, that you just don't have them. Say, for example, the kid growing up in a household environment that the parents were fighting can grow up to think that they have a low self-efficacy when it comes to maintaining successful relationships in adulthood, because they just didn't learn the abilities to do that. All right, so we're gonna go to the last section that we're gonna talk about in terms of perspective, which is the humanistic one. And humanism one brings a nice, at least for me, it brings a nice relief from all of these negative aspects of the other perspectives that we need to know about. Humanism takes a very different approach to psychodynamic theory, and they don't concern themselves too much with whether something is observable or isn't observable. Their focus is primarily on looking at the human qualities that are about growth, self-actualization, and optimal feeling. They reject the other theories because fundamentally they consider them to be just not human. And when they relate to that as human, it's just that they reduce people to either drives that they have no influence over, like in the psychodynamic theories, or in the case of behavioral theories, as being the subjects of just a world in which the environment kind of like pushes us this way and that way, and all we do is just react to the environment. They have an optimistic view of personality and human nature, in that they think that it can always be bettered and made more optimal. And they think a lot about how a person subjectively views the world as influencing their perception of the reality of the world. So think about it in terms of the nice cliches of what do my friends always say to make fun of the cliche? Manifest, manifesting, like I'm gonna become a millionaire. Those are the kinds of things that are sort of emotions that are given a little bit more space in the humanistic perspective of personality. Monica, whether or not they backlashed or the other theories backlashed at them is perhaps beyond the scope of what we need to know for the MCAT, but just know that they're in opposition to the theories. And you don't really need to know to the extent that these theories agreed or didn't agree, but it helps you to know if they were in opposition, that means that they were probably seeking different things. So it becomes easier to recognize on a question. So the first person you need to know for the humanistic perspective is Carl Rogers. And he created something that's called a person-centered theory. Already the name kind of tells us something completely different from the other theories that we've seen so far about personality. He thought that personality had one single structure, and it was called a self-concept. Sometimes it's just called self, too, but more often than not, you'll find it as self-concept. So when we talked about structures, so far we've talked about these different components. When it came to the psychodynamic people, he thought, nah, it's just self-concept. And he defined it as a collection of beliefs about our own human nature and the unique qualities and our typical behaviors. And so one example of kind of how to define it is just a mental picture. And in this example, one that says, I'm hardworking. So that's already a self-concept. The important thing about self-concept is that it's subjective, and they gave a lot of room to subjective thoughts. And so it's important to realize that our perception of self-concept being that I'm hardworking might actually not manifest itself in reality. I could say to myself, I'm very hardworking, and that makes me feel good. But if I'm spending a lot of time on Instagram, instead of focusing on reviewing different texts for these lectures, then there's something that he would term an incongruence between there would be something that's called an incongruence between them. Triggered. So yeah, I didn't call any of you out. I called myself out, but you identified yourselves in that. So there you go. No, it would be something that he would call an incongruence between our self-concept and the reality of something. And the way that it shows up in this diagram is that you go from having a belief of your self-concept, but then in the blue one, oh no, excuse me. Before I talk about this, let me go on before I talk about the diagram. So the example that I've given for congruous or incongruence is that you think you're a genius, but your GPA says otherwise, you know? Um, to some degree, Carl Rogers would talk about the fact that self-concept is really important, and it can be the motivator for us to bridge the gap between what is real and what we think is real. Um, but sometimes also self-concept is in our ability to bridge what's real between our self-concept is driven by experiences in our, particularly our childhood, um, that are defined by conditional affection or unconditional affection. Let me define what I mean by those. Conditional affection is very simply the fact that in childhood, somebody could receive affection if they behaved in a particular way. So, say that you received affection from your mother only if you cleaned your room. That would be something that's considered conditional affection. The unconditional affection, on the other hand, means that regardless of cleaning your room or not, you received affection. So it's pretty straightforward. So in many cases, in right, right. In the many cases of conditional affection, it can affect our, or it can further worsen our sense of incongruence. So now we can look at the diagram and say, like, okay, there is a personal belief that affection is conditional. And so then there's a need to distort um, some of the reality so that the person can feel worthy of affection. And then that creates incongruence between self-concept and reality. And then that produces anxiety, which then creates more defensive behaviors and more incongruence. So I know this sounds pretty theoretical. So let me see if I can take up an example for this one. There's an example I found, which is like, oh, so it's so mean, but I guess it does the trick. So consider a young woman, um, and this woman, like most people, considers herself a very nice person. But in reality, let's think that she actually isn't nice. And in fact, she's kind of conceited and selfish. So she gets feedback from her ex-boyfriends and some of her friends that she's actually kind of self-centered and a little snotty. So what does she do with this information is a question. Does she just go home and just like cry about it? In the case of thinking about this sort of mental process that Carl Rogers is proposing, the way to react to that would probably be something like she might ignore um, any of the occasions that she acts selfishly. So, um, so like she just has no recollection of any moment that they said like at this point you acted selfishly. Or she might think about the negative comments of being that the ex-boyfriends are butthurt about not being in a relationship anymore with her. And so this is just an example of how this person is going through great lengths to protect their self-concept, this idea that they're a nice person. The idea here is that there is an incongruence between reality and self-concept, and it increases anxiety. And the more the anxiety is increased, the more then these sort of thoughts of, oh, well, it must be this or it must be that, increases more of that gap between reality and self-concept. What you need to know about the slide for the MCAT is the idea that self-concept is the one structure that works in defining personality. That sometimes self-concept can match or not match reality, and that's incongruent, or congruence. And then the things that make it more difficult to achieve congruence is when people, particularly as kids, grew up with conditional affection. So that's kind of the summary of that. The next person and the last person you need to know for the humanistic perspective is Maslow. And this is somebody that I think most people have heard about. Um, oh, I got a question in the chat saying when congruence matches. It's that part's actually kind of easy, which is that if you think your self-concept is I'm a nice person, and then you survey people that know you and they say, yeah, they're a nice person. So that's when congruence happens, is when your self-concept matches reality. And that's the simple part of it. The last person you need to know for the humanistic perspective is Maslow. And he is known, for the purposes of the MCAT, he's known for his hierarchy of needs. I like this quote of his that he said back in the 60s. He said, to oversimplify the matter somewhat, it's as if Freud supplied to us the sick half of psychology, and we must now fill it with the healthy half. So what that quote is saying is that he recognizes a lot of the work that took place in early psychology with psychodynamic theories, but he recognizes also that they were so focused in abnormal behaviors and not in the healthy part. And so that's where he thought psychology had to be headed, was looking at the healthy aspects of it. And his hierarchy of needs is a great example of how he's focusing on that, because he focuses on having these particular needs that people find themselves that move from very basic to less basic needs in their lives. And people he finds are instinctually motivated to ascend up this pyramid in a systematic way. He thinks that the top part of it, sorry, I got distracted by a message. He thinks the top part of it is self-actualization. So that's the important part that you need to know for the hierarchy of needs. So self-actualization is one that's actually pretty difficult to attain. You definitely need to know these different rungs of the pyramid, so to speak, for the test. The only two that you don't need to know are the aesthetic needs and the cognitive needs. So make sure to make a note for yourself that you don't need to know those two things. For some reason, in sort of simplified forms of the hierarchy of needs, it's actually reduced to 5 hierarchy of needs, which, please stop thinking. Shit. Yeah, I don't know if is that a mnemonic for the hierarchy of needs, Sophie? It looks like it. But yeah, so yeah, exactly. Right, Sophie. So you did the right thing, which was to do 5 of them, and not in the case of Maslow's original hierarchy as it's done here, has 7. So don't think about aesthetic needs and cognitive needs. If anything, conceive of them as within the self-actualization. Okay. Yeah, Reddit. Yeah, usually the best and the worst comes from Reddit. So think about aesthetic and cognitive needs, the descriptors, as falling within in self-actualization. The only other thing I want to say about this hierarchy, other than it's sequential, so you move through it. The other thing that you need to know is that you do get to ascend these different ones without fully completing it. But the idea is that you have like a satisfactory completion of the needs. So it is theoretically possible for you to feel like you more or less have long-term survival and stability, but you kind of also might be like a college student and you're just kind of like, but if I didn't have anybody to rely on when things went south, then I might not feel completely like that need is covered. In that case, it's still okay for you to move up to the belongingness and love. So I hope that makes sense, that you don't have to fully complete something in order to move up to it. But definitely the idea isn't that you're going to be like, you know, more or less done with your physiological needs and jump up to the actualization. You definitely have to kind of uh, kind of work your way mostly through all of these. And Maslow just called the people who went to the top as called self-actualizers. And it's one of those that I never really understood, like what is actually self-actualization, but it just is a category that he called that when people are at peace with themselves. It's like when you've reached a particular place when you have a very close relationships, close, and he also named them as a small number of relationships that are very, very close. But he also talked about how the person was also independent. So how a person definitely relied on a lot of people, but didn't need them for it. So that kind of, you can think about the actualization of it, is that it's a fully mature person that, you know, has loving relationships slash all their shit together. So I don't know about you, but I'm not there. Um, and yeah, so think about it in terms of like sort of like the balances of everything. Like somebody who can really be all really good and humorous, but also very much okay being alone and quiet and reflective. That was his idea of actualization. And that's the end of the personality section. Are there any questions that I can answer about this? Slash, if there aren't anything, can I ask you some questions? Well, that's very nice of you to say, especially in light of the fact that the next time that we meet, we're going to talk about disorders, and I'm going to urge you all to um, not think you have all the disorders that we're going to talk about, which is going to be very tempting when, especially when we get to the stress disorders. Everybody starts thinking that, yep. Yeah, I say it lightheartedly, but it's actually quite serious. Don't be like one of those MCAT people that starts learning disorders and then goes to their friends saying like, "You are bipolar," when in fact they're not diagnosed with bipolar. Um, but anyways, I'm just gonna summarize really quick what we talked about. We talked about right. We talked about, that's the first lecture that we had. That's the second lecture that we had. And in this one, it's actually not entirely true. We didn't talk about disorders, but we will talk about it next time. But in this case, we talked about personality ones. Psycho dynamic is the ones that include Freud and Jung. Humanistic perspectives are the ones that include Rogers and include Maslow. Trait perspective is the ones that includes the tests that we talked about at the very beginning. And the social cognitive one is one that includes Bandura with the Bobo doll. Behaviorist is the one that includes Skinner. So it's kind of a good idea to kind of start creating some mental connections and these different theorists and kind of what they said, and unfortunately do remember the ages when they do provide some age ranges for development stages. The biological perspective we didn't talk about, but we'll start with it next time because it very much is in relation to a lot of the things that we're going to talk about, which is the disorders. I think the disorders are very cool. When I studied them for my MCAT, I had a moment where I thought like, wow, I never thought I would be interested in psychiatry. But I was suddenly like, it opened my mind and I was like, this is really interesting. All right, so I don't see any questions so far. So if I may, I'm going to ask you some questions. Sounds good. So I realize we have not very much time left. We have 7 minutes left. So we can get through some of them. They're not very many. I think it's like less than 10 questions. But I think they're good questions. And so if we don't get through them, um, can I ask you, Oh, thank you. I got a very nice message in the text. No question. I also got another question about my dog, and I do have a Merle Great Dane. That's right, I do. So I can introduce you since we're at the end technically. Say hi. Say hi. Yeah. Say hi. So so I have some questions that Roma and I can ask of you. And let's do some of them. And then if we don't finish them, we can talk about more in office hours. And then I can also provide you a copy of them so that you can do them by yourself. My only question is, I don't have a, do you want me to make a PDF of it so that you can write on it right now? Or do you want to just look at my screen? My vote is to just look at my screen so that we can just get on ahead, but otherwise it'll take me a second to make a PDF. Yeah, okay. I'm gonna do exactly what Maral just said and move on so that way we can use our time more wisely, and then I can send the PDF afterwards. Okay. Do this one in 90 seconds. Okay, that was longer than 90 seconds. What are some of the answers? Some of you have already started posting some of them. In the meantime, I was looking for a poll feature, but I can't find one. So unfortunately, I think we're just gonna have to use the chat box. Okay, so here's what we're gonna do. Let's see. Morale, you're gonna tell me why you picked A.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, okay. I was just thinking about just noticeable difference. So I was just thinking like the proportion between 100 and 125 pounds is a difference of 25 pounds. So if you have that difference, then on the same proportion, you would think between 125 and 150 pounds is the same proportion of difference. So you'd be able to tell the difference. That's my thought process.
That's the right thought process. Yeah, it's the right thought process entirely, Morale. It's not the right answer though. So while you were thinking the correct things, you didn't calculate the exact right things for it. Somebody told me D. Why did you say D?
Okay, that was me. And I was just going back to Weber's Law and I was kind of thinking about, I don't remember what it's called, but I just remember when we were doing like when we had decimals. So like in this case, wait, can I see the question again? Okay, so I know that the like decimal is 0.025 because if you put that, that'd be 25 over 100, which means there needed to be a 25-pound difference to be noticeable. And then you have to kind of convert that. So then I just that took me a while to think of, so then time was like running out.
Yeah.
You kind of had to like use that same idea with the other examples and
Yeah,
see
yeah.
would be, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for telling us. That is exactly the right thought process as well, and also the wrong answer for it. The trick about this question and why I really like this one a lot is because it asks you to think about the damn Weber just noticeable difference mathy part of psych-soc with limited time to calculate it for each one of these. So what are some of the ways in which you can kind of think about this a little bit more efficiently so that you can kind of get this what are these called? Standalone questions, like a little bit quicker. So in this case, both Morel and Sophie are right in terms of thinking about the proportion of 105 to 125. Sophie said exactly right, that it's 0.25 of a difference between the two. So now the task is to figure out the next part of the question, which is the lifter has to notice the difference between that. So remember that to notice the difference, because we were given the first condition being an increase of 0.25, that means that to notice it, we have to be given values that's like one value, and the next one has to be at least 0.25 greater than the value that we're given, right? So the way that I think about this is that I go to the easy numbers first. In my mind, B, which is 5 to 6, is not a proportion of 0.25. In fact, I don't know what it is, but I know it's not 0.25 percent of that. And then I look at C, and I think 25 to 35. I also don't think that's a proportionality of 0.25. The way I can think about it is because 25, if I half that number, is 12 and a half. And if I half that number, again, that's going to be like somewhere in the vicinity of 7, right? And so, so that makes me think, oh, excuse me, I'm saying that I initially said this wrong, is that when I look at that number, I think that it is within that 0.25 proportionality of it. So I'm already thinking that C might be the right answer. Then I tackle A and D, which are harder numbers for me to think about mentally without using one of those pens on the weird plastic pads that they give you. And then I look at 125 to 50 for option A. And I know that A cannot be the right answer. And the reason it cannot be the right answer is because the question stem says that it's 100 to 125. Therefore, you cannot have the same difference of 25 for the number being 125. Please tell me you understand why A should obviously not be the right answer. Okay, yeah, so I'm getting some feedback that you can see that A quickly is not going to be the right answer. And then D, unfortunately, is one that kind of stumps me a little bit because it could be or it could not be. And so that's when I would have to employ some math. If I was stuck for time, I would hopefully pick C and move on. But the reality is that I don't know how you thought about it all, but I would be stumped between C and D without doing some math. The correct answer is C. And the place that we saw that was in 2 lectures ago, and it was Weber's law. And then we saw that K, which is the change constant or the Weber's constant, equals the change in intensity over the original intensity. And so that's the refresher of where it was. And so hopefully I was successful in inducing a little bit of pain that is when you see the Weber's law on the test, which actually means you have to think about some math for that. And this is a pretty good way in representation of how it would show up. All right. Any questions? No? Okay. Oh, I got a question. Yeah, the original intensity would be 100 in this case. So it would be 100 and the change in intensity would be 25. 25 divided by 100 is 0.25, right? Right, think about it. It's 0.25. I don't even think about it decimals. I think about it percentages. The test writer would probably be also merciful when it comes to coming up with these numbers so that it fits into something nice, like 25% or 40% or 30% of a difference. Keep that in mind. You won't see something that is just like numbers that you can't do on the fly. Alrighty, next question. Alrighty, let's get some answers. This one is more like you know it or you don't know it. So no need to ponder too hard. Maybe for the next one, if everybody could send me a direct message of the answer instead. I don't want people to be swayed by then seeing like lots of particular type of answer. In all honesty, did anybody not say A? Come on, somebody didn't say A. No? Everybody said A? Stop it. Okay. Okay. All right. Fair enough. We got one person who said B, but unsure why. Okay. Well, this question right here is talking about the stuff that we spoke about last time. This one, I'm curious if any of you, yeah, okay, so Jonathan is beginning to say some of the stuff that I was hoping, which is that hopefully there's just like, you kind of picked A because it makes sense, but that hopefully the other answer choices were not that clear in terms of like why they weren't the other ones. So Jonathan, thank you. So why can you rule out acoustic listening, or why can you rule out acoustic as to these answer choices? Why is it not the right answer choice? Right. Yeah. Okay. You use common sense. Right. Good. Good. Alrighty. Yes, that's really good, Jonathan. So to not remember the things you hear. Gotcha. Okay. Good, Morale. That's a good thought process to have. That meaning-based things stick in our memory a little bit better. I got in the chat a question that says, what is iconic? Can somebody tell me what iconic means? What they think it means in terms of memory? What sensory organ do we use for iconic encoding? I got a message in the chat that says visual. That's correct. Yeah. Yep. Eye. Good. Right. And echoic is hearing. Good. So these are terms that are beginning to kind of make some connections. So iconic eye, echoic ear. it's easy to think about echo is a hearing phenomena when you hear an echo, and you see an icon. You don't hear an icon. Where we spoke about this was last time when we talked about encoding. It was when we first were talking about in this information processing theory where we talked about the encoding, the storage, and the retrieval. When we were talking about encoding, we talked about there's the types and also how deep they go into the encoding. We talked about structural. So hopefully if you were super on top of this chart, it might have confused you because you were like, where's structural? But if you read the definition of structural, it's talking about the physical attributes of a stimulus. And the physical attributes of a stimulus, in this case, it's the visual appearance of letters on the page or the screen. So visual is actually related to the structural part in this case. It's also the shallowest. So that should be eliminated because if it's the shallowest, then it'll be most difficult to encode into memory, which means that it'll be less likely that it'll be in long-term memory, which will be less likely that we'll then take it out of long-term memory. The next one is phonomic, which is also here related to acoustic, because phonomic is about the sound of the word. And so that one's an intermediate level of encoding. And the deepest is semantic. So a lot of people relied on their gut feeling that semantic made sense, that it would be the one that you would most likely remember, something you would most likely recall. But it's good to actually remember them within the context of why it is the deepest one. And it's exactly because you attribute meaning to it. So so then iconic. Where's iconic at? And I'll answer that to you for some so we can move on. Iconic, we talked about as sensory memory. We talked about sensory memory in that like first little box of memory where we talked about sensory memory, then short-term memory, then long-term memory. We talked in sensory memory that we have echoic and that we have iconic sensory memory. And remember that iconic, we talked about which one was the longer or the shorter one, iconic or echoic memory before it decayed. Iconic shorter. How short is iconic? Is it more or less than 1 second? There we go. Yeah, fraction of a second. And how long is echoic? Is it more or greater than a second? I'm sorry, I don't know what you mean. Yeah, echoic is multiple seconds. Right, right. Echoic is more. Good, good. Echoic is more than a second. We talked about it being 2 to 3 seconds in our case. So more important than knowing the lengths of before they decay, it's to know that relative to each other, iconic is much shorter than echoic. And in terms of this question, what it hopefully tries to do is to confuse you between visual and iconic and make you think, oh, they're just repeating the same concept twice. It's not the case. It's actually two different concepts. All right, we're going to move on to the next question right now. Okay, alrighty. We got a number of messages, or I did, and all of you just got Jonathan's message. Um, so, Eileen, could you tell us, if you wouldn't mind, why you selected B?
Um, can you hear me?
Yes.
All short-term results.
Okay, now I can't hear you.
Oh, I see short-term in the question.
Oh, I'm sorry, Eileen, I can't hear you. I'm getting like some staticky kind of thing. You see the short term in the question. Ah, yeah. Okay, good. Alrighty. So you see short term. Okay, good. Good, good. Good, Morale. Brooke, if you wouldn't mind unmuting and saying why you chose B. That's okay, Eileen. Thank you for trying.
Sorry. I said B because I thought it was right.
Yeah. I mean, I'm like, honestly wondering.
Just like his, I mean, that's what we talked about that's what I thought we talked about self-efficacy was your belief that you could do something or not do something.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I honestly picked this question, Brooke, because of hoping that people would have the sort of experience of having heard of one of the concepts, but not formally being introduced, or at least not with me anyways, to any of the other concepts. And so then the task was to be like, well, is it the thing I know or is it not? And if it is, then let's go for it. But if it's not, then what would be the thought process into like guessing which of the other three it was? Brooke is entirely right, as is Eileen. That the answer is B. It's self-efficacy. But instead of telling you a lot about A, C, and D, one of the ways that you kind of have to think about the test is just finding the reasons why the choice that you're making is actually the right one. And then Eileen brought up the fact of a short term, which is a really good thing to think about. The other one that the other one that was hopefully that stood up, the other aspect of the question stem that I hope people looked at was that no matter how hard he studies, and that was the thing that I was trying to drive home about self-efficacy, was the perception of not having the abilities to be able to carry out a particular, in this case, a particular task. And then in terms of the short term, is the sense that that the learned helplessness and the low self-esteem and external locus of control have a lot to do with long-term effects of things. We did not talk about self-efficacy of being short-term or long-term, but had you had more background in A, C, or D, those things should ring bells in long-term effects, which makes this question a lot more easy because if you identify short-term, then you know that it's not one of those three things. And then, yeah, some people were thinking about the capabilities and yeah, okay, good. So good. So hopefully this can kind of reinforce this idea that we talked about self-efficacy. And who was the person that was talking about self-efficacy? I'll answer that in a second, Monica. Yeah, that's right. Thanks, Sophie and Alep. That's right. It was Bandura, and looking at observational learning and self-efficacy. So important to keep the name associated with the theory as well. Monica, what to me makes B the right answer, looking at the question stem, is this fact that says, no matter how hard he studies. And that's the part to me that rings a bell of not having the capability. Yeah, Sophie.
Okay, this is how I remember it. Someone like doing band, like at school or something, and they're like really bad at it, and they just feel like they're not getting better and like can't get better. That's how you can remember it.
Ah, yes. Yeah, I've always thought about band with Bandura, but I never, because like I think of band and Bandura, but I never thought of a way to connect it. So thank you for that. That definitely helps. And then Bandura in Arabic means tomato. Perfect, perfect. This is perfect. So whatever it is that for you helps you a lot for remembering it in a personal sense, keep those things always reinforced in your mind. Alrighty, let's go on to the next question. Alrighty, let's get some answers in direct message, please. Oh, I love these direct messages. Now you truly see people's colors and they're not swayed by massive answers. Alrighty. Michaela, would you mind telling us why you selected A?
I put A because from what I remember, a reaction formation is like when you say you hate someone, but like deep down you love them. And so I thought in this scenario, like obviously you would not like someone that kidnapped you. But then if you like start to experience these feelings of like affection for them, then I would imagine that that is, I thought it was reaction formation, but I feel like it's actually either C or D.
Right, I was gonna ask you, then you thought of it as a different answer. So why did you think maybe C?
And then I thought it was C because I remember displacement was like, oh, like something happened at, I think displacement was when like something happened at work. So I come home and like yell at my significant other. Whereas like projection is like me feeling some type of way based on someone else.
Mm-hmm,
But I don't really understand the difference, but I think it's projection.
mm-hmm,
Because it's more relating to the self than like taking it out on someone else. I really don't know though.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. I'm glad you brought up all of this because it really points to the fact that these are not intuitive names and definitions to remember. And you can easily trick yourself into thinking that one of these defense mechanisms is actually termed the other one. So your first gut feeling, Michaela, was right. It's reaction formation. And then when you thought too much about it and thought about C and D, you were doing the thing that I think is the easy trap. particularly, I think the C is the other one that's very tricky, because what we're talking about projection was talking about um, projecting the negative emotions to the person that was creating those emotions. So in the example, it was like a person hates her boss and then uses projection to then think that, oh no, it's actually the boss that hates me. So the fact that there's this sort of reciprocal thing is one that I think in Stockholm syndrome would show up in ways that might confuse you. But think about projection as there was no mention of the other person. And in fact, it was just about turning the person turning their feelings of hostility into the opposite feeling. So whereas projection and displacement worry a lot about the targets, reaction formation actually worries about flipping the emotion. And that's it. But things that I can never hate, things that make me feel better. Right, right. Yeah. Exactly. That's a good way that, Sophie, in which if the question was written that way, it would be, in that case, projection. Exactly. The right answer is A. And the place that we saw that was we were looking at Freud's defense mechanisms, which were ways to relieve, in his study and understanding of them, were ways to relieve anxiety. And anxiety was a product of a conflict between the super ego and the id in his understanding of it. The one that I told you not to worry too much about is identification, but the rest of them, please know those. Alrighty. If you're willing to hang on for 4 more minutes, I can give you one more question. And this is it. Alrighty, starting to get some nice answers, lots of them being with question marks, with lots of uncertainty. Um, the okay, so Cameron, if you wouldn't mind, could you tell us why you picked C?
Sure. So I chose C because it it says that it's a list of names of musicians in an individual's favorite band. So there's some connection to the individual themselves, which to me made sense of why that over the other options would be most likely to be stored long term.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What about, so let me ask you this, which option or options were you able to easily remove from the process of elimination?
I think A and B pretty easily because in A you have the nonsense words, so there would seemingly be no real, at first glance, no real connection to the individual. And then 15 randomly selected people, if they're random, then less likely to be stored in long-term memory. And so those are the easiest to take out, in my opinion. And then the last option is a list of dates of battles in Peloponnesian War. So that could or couldn't be, but there's no real indication as to why it should be stored in long-term memory based on the question stem. So that was just my thought process.
Yeah, and I had the same one, Cameron. In fact, I think that if for this question, for the option C, if they took out individual's favorite out of that option, then you really couldn't make a selection between C and D. Because I think I think that our intuition makes us think that Peloponnesian War dates are pretty boring, and so more likely that they'll just never be encoded into our memory, which is partly true. But but it could be that the fact is the person is a historian, and so then it does have meaning to it. So I think the only thing that actually lets us select C versus D is the favorite part to it. And most people agree with C. And yeah, I got a question saying if a person lived during the Peloponnesian Wars, then it would be most likely D. Yeah, I mean, it would definitely be something that would be more impactful to their lives. And so then there is a greater likelihood of it getting encoded into long-term memory, for sure. Alrighty, I'm 30 minutes over. I have one question I really want to show you though. It's like, and it's, so if you're willing to hang around, no pressure. You were free from like 30 minutes ago, but this question is good. So if you're willing to hang around, here we go. Okay, this one I need more answers. People are not answering. I need more answers, even if they have question marks right next to them. Okay, keep on sending me answers. A lot of people are saying, well, there's all over the place, and people are saying the right answer, but every person that said the right answer has a question mark next to the right answer. Okay, no, there's one person that didn't put a question mark next to the right answer. Okay, so Jonathan, could you tell us what you picked with some level of uncertainty? And why, if you wouldn't mind unmuting yourself. Because okay, right. Because already, I feel like a lot of us share that feeling. Mikey, would you mind telling us why you picked C?
I just remember that's what the optic chiasm does. The temporal visual fields go to the same side of the brain, right? Like the right one goes to the right side, and then the optic chiasm is what it crosses the nasal visual fields.
That's almost right. That's almost right. You skipped a part. You said that the visual fields. So I want to get one more input, but you're on the right track, Mikey. Brooke, your answer had D question mark, question mark, question mark. Can you tell us why?
Honestly, I just didn't think the other ones were right. I didn't really
Okay, okay,
have.
that's good. Why were they not right? Or why maybe were they not right?
I don't know. I also vaguely remember us talking about losing temporal vision for some reason, but I couldn't remember what that was. So I
Yeah.
don't know. It was a big guess, hence the 3 question marks.
Yeah, I did this question. I did all of these questions to see, just to kind of see like how I would do, and this was like flatly wrong. I was one step from being right, and so I will say to those of you who picked option C are wrong, and you were almost right in picking the right answer. I hope that you might also consider that A could be eliminated. I think, well, maybe not A, but for sure B. Oh no, it's okay. That's okay. Thank you. But I think that option B is the one that hopefully you were thinking that was just flat out wrong. And the reason I hope that you might be thinking that B was wrong is because of the fact that we never talked about upper visual fields. So we never talked about upper versus lower visual fields. We always talked about left versus right visual fields. That's right. I know that's wrong. Um, so so hopefully everybody eliminated B or was on your way to eliminate B. The rest is hard. We saw the this tract 2 lectures ago when we were looking at the sensory processing in the eye. And it's so tricky to confuse these because every step along the process, we're kind of switching back and forth and back and forth. And so we need to keep straight what, if something comes in one particular way, how will it end up at the end of the process? So, so, so here's the diagram. So let's use the left visual field. The left visual field is the purple things, and one of it strikes the temporal side of the opposite eye, and the other one strikes the nasal side of the same side eye. Then they go down their respective optic nerves. They do, one of them, the nasal side, does a switch at the optic chiasm and then goes to the right side. So the end result is that left visual field information is projected onto the right occipital lobe. That is called the contralateral or contralateralization of the brain that we've seen with some other, also some other sensory information. So the question here is asking us, it's telling us that we have a tumor that's pressing up against the optic chiasm. And so what is that going to do? So we obviously don't know the medical sense of it, which is actually something called temporal hemianopsia or something like that. But we don't need to know that. What we need to know is looking at the options and eliminating them. You would not be completely blind in one eye from a pituitary growth, because as we see, you would either be blind in both eyes if affected or none of the eyes. So as we can see, sorry about my dog, folks. So as we can see, it's telling us that there's a defect oh, sorry, we're not told that the visual defect is in just one eye. But how can I explain A? The if we had if the pituitary tumor was affecting our optic chiasm, it would end up having a result of taking away the vision from both sides of the visual field. Oh my gosh, I am so sorry, folks. I need to go mute my doc. Be 1 second. I'm sorry, folks. So it's not it wouldn't cause complete blindness of it. The point that I was stumped on was between option C and D. And the correct answer is option D. The loss of the temporal visual fields is a part that I think is really a tricky part to it, which is that when we spoke about visual fields, as you can see in the diagram, we spoke about it in terms of left and right visual fields. And we talked about temporal and nasal optic nerves, but we never said temporal or nasal visual fields. So that's the part to it that is a little tricky. And that's kind of what the MCAT does. It always presents something to you that when you reason through it makes sense, but you probably haven't heard about it, and so it tricks you. So for option D, if you look at the diagram, the temporal visual field is going to be the visual fields that come from the temporal side of our eyes, meaning that your left eye and your right eye have temporal visual fields because of the fact of you can see the rays that are hitting them. So if you follow the temporal visual fields parts, those images are the ones that would be affected by the optic chiasm. And then you would not be able to see those visual fields in the eye. Let me see if I can explain that a little bit better. Yeah, I got a message that I don't get it. Let me see if I can do a better job explaining of it. So, the nerve fibers that come from the nasal tract are the ones that do the crossing over. Correct. You're not wrong, Sophie. So the nerves are affected. Correct. Yes. So the nerves that do the crossing over are the ones that are affected. So if those nerves are affected, what is the visual field that is affected, that is lost? Oh, that's a good way to think about it. So we know that the nasal nerve fibers are the ones that do the crossover. But what visual input do they get? They get temporal visual input, like Michaela said, question mark. Exactly. So if you're affecting the nerves that do the crossover, then you would affect, in turn, you would lose then the temporal images, which is what they get. Yeah, you could think about it, Michaela, in terms of the sense that there is a crossover that happens between the visual fields and the fibers. That's one way to think about it. Yeah, there is a cross right there as well. Because you see that they crisscross. Sophie, you're not convinced. So let me start by defining, no, you're totally right. Let me try to annotate and see if my thing doesn't freak out. And this is the last thing we'll do. But I think this is a good question because it's as hard as it gets. Alrighty. Fuck. It did the thing I was hoping it wouldn't do. Sorry, folks. I don't know if you're seeing what I'm seeing, but my thing is freaking out. Okay. I don't know why, folks, but it doesn't like it when I try to annotate, and it's really crazy. Sorry. I'm not able to annotate, so so hopefully, gosh, this is not going well. All right. Let me try that one last time. Okay. Alrighty, folks. So can I zoom into the picture? Yes, I think I can by increasing this. Okay. Hopefully you can all see this a little bit better. And so temporal side, don't think about nerves or visual fields, but temporal means by the temples. Nasal means by the nose, right? So the nasal retinas of both eyes, meaning the retinal fibers that are closest to the nose, if you see the visual field that they're getting, they're receiving visual information from the temporal sides of the visual field. Do you see that? They're not getting visual information from the middle of the field. They're getting visual information from the outer aspects of the field. So if you have a pituitary tumor that constricts the optic chiasm and inhibits the crossover, that means that you're not going to get the visual inputs that the nasal side is giving you, which means that you lose the temporal visual input in both of your eyes. Give me some feedback. Does that make sense?
Yeah, can I just speak?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so that makes sense. I feel like why I'm a little confused is I just went back and I just pulled up the slide from that lecture to see the picture bit bigger. And I have like written down that because of the crossover effect, if you have eye damage, you are still able to transmit images to the left and right side of the brain. So I guess it was kind of just confusing. The way I wrote it, I just thought that maybe like the damage in the optic chiasm. I don't know if you know what I'm saying, but
Yeah. I made that big point when we were talking about that, Sophie, by saying like, what is the big deal about the optic chiasm? Like, why does it matter? And then I said it's because without it, if you lose sight out of one eye, then you lose the projection onto one side of the brain. And the optic chiasm allowed for you to have projection on both sides of the brain from just a single eye. So that was that part about it. So that still holds true. But what's happening right here is that the question is trying to get you to think about what happens when you mess with the optic chiasm, specifically the crossover. So what happens to the visual field that hits the nasal side? Right. So the visual field that hits the nasal side does not make it to the occipital lobe. Left eye hits the temporal eye, right? And it's crossed over when it hits. Think about it. Michaela, could you unmute yourself and let us know a little bit more what you mean by that? Because I think you're onto it.
So like basically light coming from the left visual field, it like automatically somehow, I mean, I feel like this is not like, the most accurate way to say it, but like light from the left visual field automatically hits your right temporal space, whereas the light from the left field will go to your left, nasal side and have to switch at the optic chiasm. So like the switch occurs at two different locations.
Right, right. So
Okay.
that's where somebody else brought up the crisscross. So
Right.
one way to think about this, if it works for you and if it doesn't confuse you, there's a crossover that happens between the visual field and the retina, and a crossover that happens with the nerves in the brain. If that works for you. If it doesn't, forget what I said, if that begins to confuse you. And so when you cross two things twice, you end up with the same thing at the end. If that doesn't make sense, please ignore it and throw it away. But exactly, you're right, Michaela, and then you're also right, Sophie, in your kind of elaboration of it, which is that you lose the temporal side, but still have the nasal side, which does not exactly, as Sophie said, you're not completely blind. You have just lost the visual input from the sides of your world, but you still have the center of it because the crossover only affects two nerves, not all four of the nerves. Michaela, you are right in making that mistake in thinking C, but the reason why it's not C is because the question asking the loss of the nasal visual fields, not of the not it's what's confusing about that is that you might be thinking that you're losing the information of the nasal fibers, but it's actually the nasal visual fields. That the questions that option C is telling you. And you don't lose the nasal visual fields because the nasal visual fields are the ones from the center. So if you look at the diagram, it's kind of like in the middle between where it says left and visual fields. That the side of those things are hitting the temporal, right, it's hitting the temporal sides, which are unaffected by the crossover. And yeah. I so wish I could annotate on this thing so I could. So the nasal visual fields don't cross over. The nasal visual fields, I'm looking so I don't mess this up. So the temporal visual fields cross over, whereas the nasal visual fields do not cross over. Exactly. Okay, perfect. And yeah, I wish I could track this with a pencil, but unfortunately, I'm not able to. You know, one of you might be able to, with your Zoom, use the marker and help me out. Are you able to annotate on this thing? Because for some reason I'm not.
Yes.
Okay, Brooke. Alrighty. So do a little test. Like, just do like something, a script. Perfect, perfect. Alrighty, you can. Awesome. Okay, Brooke, you're going to be my hand. Okay. So what I wanted to do is write temporal on to the left of the purple band, right? Temporal visual field.
Like here?
Oh shoot, I'm not seeing anything. No. What I mean is where the purple band is, where at the top of the diagram where it says left visual field. Right, yeah, right there. Exactly. So put a big T right there. Exactly. Now put another T on the opposite side of that band, on the blue side. Exactly. Now put an N in between those two T's. Alrighty, what Brooke has just diagrammed for us is that the visual field it could be either thought of as a left or right-handed visual field, Or also you could think about it temporal, which is the sides, or nasal, which is the center of it. And why that's the case is because the nasal is just straight out from the nose and the temporal is on either side of your temples. So hopefully that part makes sense so far. So if you look at the diagram of the temporal ones, the temporal rays. So Brooke, now I want you to highlight right, exactly. And then do that one. Okay. So what Brooke has done is has taken the lines that come from the nasal side. This diagram isn't perfect for that, but the way you know those are the nasal ones is because they're closer to the center of it. So what Brooke has shown us is that these nasal visual fields are doing a crossover and they hit the temporal nerves of each one of the eyes. And so when you track that visual input with the nerves, if you follow it, it turns out that those visual inputs are not affected at the crossover and they just go down to the same side as the eyes that they're hitting. Meaning that if you have a tumor at the crossover, those visual inputs from the temporal fields are unaffected. Now, Brooke, if you can erase those two lines and then do the other two lines of the temporal visual field.
Wait, I just did temporal, right?
No, you did nasal. The reason you did nasal was because that visual, those rays are from the centermost rays of the visual field. The temporal ones are the ones that are even farther out.
So it matters where they come from, not where they hit in your eye.
Well, I guess where they come from determines where they're going to hit in your eye. So would you mind drawing the other two rays that you didn't draw in the first one, or highlighting those? Yes. Yes, okay. I can see both of the rays that Brooke has done. Those rays are coming from the temporal side. This diagram isn't perfect for it because it's kind of like they're both bisect at the same point in the left or right visual field. But you need to know that they're temporal because they are coming from like the outermost source of the visual field at the edges of it. Those two temporal visual fields hit the nasal retinas. The basal retinas are the ones that do the crossover. Because of the tumor being at the optic chiasm, then those visual inputs do not make it to the occipital lobe. And when they don't make it to the occipital lobe, you do not see the temporal visual fields. Does that begin to make more sense to everybody?
Yes, got it. Thank you for your patience.
No, thank you for the patience. I wish I could have thought of a better diagram and a better way of explaining this. But I want to assure you that this can show up on the MGAT, this level of intricacy. When it comes to this optic chiasm situation. And the reason why it can show up is because it's so prone to mistakes because you have to flip-flop so much when it comes to the eye. So it's worthwhile for you to diagram very carefully to know where the visual input crosses over and where it makes it. And to make a distinction, as this question shows us, between visual fields and the nerves, because the nerves are the opposite of their visual fields in this particular case. So the temporal visual field hits the nasal side. That's where I got confused, yes. And I could have done a better job explaining that, Brooke. Yeah, in all cases, Sophie, yes, it is all the cases, but forget what I said about in this case. What I meant in this case is just kind of that the problem is highlighting this particular intricacy of how those things do it. But this could be an easy point if you took the time to really track everything about the eye, or it could be just one of those questions that if you saw this honestly on the test day, you gotta pick and move on, because this is one that you gotta kind of understand it, and you just don't have enough time to diagram. Maybe if you hustle in other sections and other questions, but most likely not, you don't have time to diagram where everything is. And even if you do, you still might not get it right. So this is just the one that I love this question because it raises how much this eye situation can be tricky if you don't have it down cold. Temporal nerves go to the nasal. The other way around, the nasal field goes to the temporal nerves. Yes. The nasal field goes to the, you may as well just write that. Nasal field goes to the temporal nerves, and the temporal visual field goes to the nasal nerves. Meaning that that's the one that you would lose. Okay, let me just recap. Option A is complete blindness in one eye. That doesn't make sense because, as we can see, both the temporal and the nasal fields are involved in both eyes. So either you would be blind in both or neither. The loss of the upper visual fields hopefully is now bogus because we've never spoken about upper and lower visual fields. We've always talked about them in terms of right and left. And now we've added an extra layer of thinking about them as temporal or nasal, which in this case, you can think about center or outer. And then the complication is C and D. The right answer is D. Okay, all right. That was a lot of confusion. And that's, I was hopeful that that would cause some distress I lost myself, in some folks with it. Yeah, so Sophie, what I can do is I can provide a PDF of these ones and I'll put the answers at the end of the PDF. There's a couple of other questions here that we didn't talk about. I think like 3 more questions. And we can talk about those more in office hours if you want to do that, which technically started 2 minutes ago. Or you can just message me and we can talk about those later. Who's temporal visual because the nasal nerve is impacted by the right temporal? Yes, Michaela. Yes. Get that tattoo. Yes. Don't. Yeah. Now try to never ever confuse that, even though it's so tricky. Okay, folks. Thank you for spending yet another over 1 hour with me. Sorry again. It's never my intent nor that of any instructors to. We really do try to budget ourselves for 2 hours, but hopefully you can bear with us because the more we get to talk about it, the more prepared you will hopefully be. Understandably, we understand that attention spans are also limited, so thank you for the patience. I guess very technically, this is now called the office hour. So everybody is more than welcome to stay and ask questions. Like I said, I have 2 more questions that I can talk about. I will require a 5, maybe 4-minute potty break, as well as I gotta feed the dog, which will get her out of here. But I can be right back. So anybody wants to stay, feel free to stay, but let's just call it 5 minutes and be back I'll be back at 5:08.